Hi, it's Pastor Dennis once again, and it's time for Tuesday Talks with Pastor Dennis. Today, let's take a moment and talk about something that you may have seen that seems somewhat curious. Maybe you've seen people wearing masks recently, usually in places that they normally would not be wearing them. Why is that? Well, it's actually a very good thing for right now. But for some, it can be scary or at least a little unnerving to see people wearing masks. But there are some very good people who get to wear masks. Firemen, they wear masks. People who work in hospitals will often wear masks. Firemen, they wear masks to protect themselves from smoke. People who work in hospitals, like nurses or doctors, they're going to wear the masks so that they protect themselves from becoming ill. You may have seen some videos that are out that are showing people how to make their own masks. Often, they're very colorful. Usually, what they'll do is they'll take some material, make a few special cuts, and then stitch things together. Today, I'd like to stitch a few Bible passages together. We're going to start with Luke chapter 4. And in this passage, we're going to see that Jesus reads from the Bible. But the Bible that Jesus would have read from would have looked somewhat different than ours. First, the words would have been in a different language, but what I want to point out right now is that our Bibles have their pages that are glued together like we see here. But the Bible that Jesus would have read from would have been a scroll. That's a long roll of paper that can be curled back up, that has all the Bible passages written on it. More like a roll of Christmas paper, just not quite as wide or as colorful. It would have been about the length of a ruler in width. And Jesus is going to read from the book of Isaiah. And what we know about Isaiah is it's a pretty long book. The scroll that Jesus would have read as he unrolled it could have been up to about 24 feet in length. And we read in Luke 4, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And he opened the book and found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord.' And he closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, 'Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing.'" As simple as it sounds, what we read here is that he receives a scroll, unrolls it, reads a passage that centers on him, rolls it back up, and hands it back to the attendant. And one thing that I find so interesting about this passage is that there are other verses in the Bible that speaks of God unfolding creation or unrolling it. As we read in Isaiah 45:12, "It is I who made the earth and created man upon it. I stretched out the heavens with my hands." Or in Psalm 104, speaking of God's majesty, "Covering yourself with light as with a cloak, stretching out heaven like a tent curtain." So in poetic fashion, in the beginning of creation, God stretches out the heavens. Similarly, in the Old and New Testaments, we read that at the end of time, God will roll creation back up. As we read in Isaiah 34:4, "And all the host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll." In the beginning, God unrolls creation. At the end, he rolls it back up. What happens in between? We read in Psalm 40, verse 7, "Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me." Another translation renders that, "In the volume of the scroll it is written of me." This passage is speaking about Jesus Christ. It tells us that everything from Genesis 1:1 through Revelation 22:21 pertains to and centers on Jesus Christ. In the beginning, God unrolls creation, and at the end, he rolls it back up. And everything in between, from the beginning to end, all of history centers on the person and work of Jesus Christ. In like fashion, in Luke chapter 4, Jesus is handed a roll, unrolls the scroll, reads from it a passage that centers on him, and rolls it back up. It is no more difficult for the God who rules over all of creation, whether that's unrolling creation or rolling it back up, than it is for someone to take up a curled piece of paper and roll it back up. In these trying times, know that the God that we serve, he rules over all of creation, and he will watch over you. He is your security and strength.